Well, this is back to school season, and we just saw the passing out of third grade Bibles. So I thought it was appropriate in that spirit to have a little math review this morning. So math people are like, yes, and everyone else is, ooh. But that's okay. Are you ready? You can use all of your partners, all of your lifelines. Here we go. 1 plus 1 is, oh boy, 2 plus 2 is, yes, you see where we're going. 4 plus 4 is, all right, arithmetic, okay. Let's take it up a notch. 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. And 7 times 70? 490. That's right, 490 for those of us whose times tables might be a little bit rusty. The scripture today, as we just heard it, is chock full of numbers and math. And I don't know how you feel about math, but some people have a little bit of a phobia. Peter comes up to Jesus, for example, in verse 21, and I can only imagine proudly ask the Lord, Lord, should I forgive my brother or sister 7 times? And then later, Jesus dives into a parable about a slave owing a king 10,000 talents. Now, let's not speed by that number. It's very, very mathy. 1 talent was about 15 years worth of wages for the slave. So 10,000 talents would be 150,000 years of wages. Now, some of you are already starting to compute that in your head, and I just want you to know that you're my people. Those people. So recall that Jesus is a rabbi. And Pastor Jim's been recently leading us through Sermons on the Plain. We know that rabbis love to use hyperbole and exaggeration to make a point. So Jesus is doing that in this story as well. This slave with an impossibly large debt to the king, he comes across a fellow slave who just owes him 100 denarii, which is, 1 denarius was worth about 1 day's wages. So numbers are all over this passage, and there are numerous lessons that we might try to draw from it. But today we're going to focus on one, the math of forgiveness. So I have to confess, I relate to Peter. Like in this story, I wonder if Peter is asking how many times he must forgive a brother or sister, because he has a few extra grace required people in his life. So years ago in a small group that Tim and I participated in, some conversations about extra grace required people would bubble up in group. And so we started referring to those people as Edgars. Extra grace required. I don't know that should stick here, but I'm just saying it's a shorthand for talking about people that you may need to forgive. So these might be people in the church maybe that are chronically late, or someone who cuts you off in the church parking lot, or a person who may tend to be gossipy. So I think if we're honest, and we shouldn't judge Peter too harshly, most of us have a forgiveness budget. And we know when somebody is exceeding it or taxing it. So I relate to Peter on this point. The number of times I think most of us are inclined to forgive someone when they owe us something is maybe 7. I mean, maybe some of us might go 14 times forgiving someone. But I can tell you, even in my most holy moments, 21 times seems outrageous to me. So what is it about that number of 490? Some scholars say that Jesus, being a rabbi, being very immersed in his scriptures, was actually kind of giving a shout out to Lamech and the story that's in Genesis 4:24, where Lamech was boasting about how much revenge he was going to take, and he said 490 times. So we can't know for sure, but that's what some scholars say. At any rate, we would be wise to consider our own narrow capacity to forgive before we judge Peter. So let's dig a little bit deeper. We're going to see that this parable about the kingdom of heaven is really more about multiplication than division. So during this period of the Roman Empire, there were strict rules governing the enforcement of contracts to include the relationships between slaves and masters. A slave indebted to the tune of 150,000 years of wages could be sold. His family, too. It was completely legitimate. It was the purview of the king, however, to release his slave, forgive the debt if he so chose. And we hear in this parable, as Jesus is telling it, that that's what the king did. The slave bows before him, asks for mercy, and the king forgives the debt. Now let's pause just for a moment. What is the biggest debt you owe? You don't have to say it out loud. Just think about it. For some of us, it might be the mortgage that we have on our home. For others, it could be an auto loan balance or some student loan debt that we may still have. Maybe you borrowed money from a family member or a friend, and it hangs like a weight on your shoulders. Close your eyes. I'll do it too, so you won't feel uncomfortable. Close your eyes. Imagine the feeling right now of that debt being paid. It's gone. Off the books. You are free. How's that feel? Hebrew law has this concept of debt forgiveness, sakah in Hebrew, baked into its culture with the year of Jubilee. We can read about this in Leviticus 25. Every seventh Sabbath year, debts were canceled, land was returned to its original owner, and the Israelites were reminded of the very nature and character of God. To be generous, to be forgiving, to be a God of kind of settling debts and equalizing across peoples. So the listeners of this parable, the people who are tuned into Jesus, or the readers or hearers of the Gospel of Matthew would be very familiar with this practice. And they may have thought, oh, Jesus is telling a story about this very generous king who's practicing salak. But just as they might have been nodding their heads in agreement with the righteous king, Jesus takes this story in a very different direction. This slave, this forgiven one who was a debtor and is now a creditor with a fellow slave, demands that the 100 denarii be paid. And when that slave asks for mercy, our forgiven slave offers none, has him thrown into prison. Last week, Pastor Jim reminded us that Jesus said to his disciples, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but you do not do what I ask?" Jesus, I think, had such a heart for his disciples. He knew his time was very, very limited with them. 3 years, 1/10 of his total time on earth. And Jesus knows the math of forgiveness. He understands that kingdom life is life at a heavenly scale. He longs for his followers to grasp what the kingdom of heaven is like. And in the passages leading up to Matthew 18, he's been teaching his disciples and laying out for them principles of living, how to get along with other people, how to add accountability with grace, and how to subtract some ego and pride. So Peter's small, kind of self-interested question, how many times, Lord? 7? To us, it kind of reveals his naivete. He doesn't really understand the math of forgiveness. And the math of forgiveness is about this. It's not how much you forgive, but instead it's about you being forgiven. I think Nelson Mandela understood this parable when he said resentment or unforgiveness is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. Setting a forgiveness budget like Peter wants to do here is a little bit like taking small doses of daily poison. The Gospel of Matthew does not record or otherwise let us know why the slave does not forgive his fellow debtor. It only records that the slave refuses. So in the end, the king gets wind of the servant's behavior, and as we heard, it doesn't go well for him. He's called before the king. The king says, why didn't you do as I do? I showed you mercy. Why did you not show mercy? And the parable says that the king is angry. And he hands the debtor now over to be tortured until his debt is paid in full, which we know is impossible because that debt is impossibly large. And so that means the torture is forever. That unforgiveness is going to ultimately kill that slave. Then Jesus drops the mic in this parable. So it will go with every one of you if you do not forgive from your heart. No budget, unlimited from your heart. If this story was being brought to life on screen in the manner of, say, The Office, Dwight Schrute would say, so 490 times, right? 490 times. There are people in our lives, if you don't know who Dwight Schrute is, there are people in our lives who just want to know, tell me the rules, I will do it. No more, no less. But we now know that the math of forgiveness isn't really about that number. The parable began, the kingdom of heaven is like. So the kingdom of heaven is much bigger, much better, much more generous, much more grace-filled than we can imagine. How do we respond to such a story? What if we're bad at math? All kinds. Not just the math of forgiveness. Well, I think there's at least two things we can do in response to make our lives more like Christ's. One, we can add emphasis and meditate on that powerful line from the Lord's Prayer, which we are going to say in just a moment. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Think about the Edgars. Think about the extra grace required people. Think about your family members, your colleagues who may have sinned against you, and forgive them. Now, it's important to note that Jesus teaches about the boundaries of healthy relationships, and forgiveness, he does this before Matthew 18 and after. Forgiveness does not mean toleration of unhealthy relationships and abuse. But it does mean freeing yourself from drinking that daily poison. The second thing we can do is we can multiply our gratitude and live like people who are forgiven. And if we think about it, those are two different things. There are two stories in this parable, after all. We focused on the action of the stubborn, unforgiving slave, but perhaps the greater action in the story is that of the merciful, patient, and gracious king who forgave an impossibly large debt. God shows us the math of forgiveness. You and I are forgiven more times than 7, more times than 70 times 7. You and I, with practice, can do this math.